Hello, and welcome back from on top of the wall. I like to start by saying something before we get into the video. Whenever I make a deck, it usually, on average, is about a 20-hour process through going through sometimes thousands of cards and multiple decks. Sometimes I can go through over 10 variations of the same deck, all using different kinds of strategies and different synergies and different mechanics, using similar cards or variations of the same card. And it can end up being a lot to try to sum up in a very short video. So I don't really think that deck techs are quite the medium or style that I'm really going for or should be using for all of this actual research that I've done. Just the number of searches alone on Scryfall should probably point out the amount of effort going into it. I don't think that it's appropriate for a 5-minute or 10-minute or even 15-minute video anymore, so I don't really want to do those anymore. And I'm just going to be going into the process of deck building for each one of these and discussing all the variations for each deck and each playstyle that I'm working with. So with that being said, let's get into the video. Alright, so as you can see here, and probably already guessed, I have a bunch of variations of the same deck. I have version 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are just the most distinct and unique variations out of all of the ones that I tried and all the ones that I looked at and tried to work with. So to get to this version 4, I started with this ragtag list of a lot of single cards and a lot of this and that, trying to figure out, oh, well, how good is this thing? How good is that? What about this or that? And these are a bunch of cards that didn't actually make it into the deck, and these are just some of them. And in this this first version, I was just really seeing what kind of synergies are here between these kinds of cards, and whether or not like some of these cards are definitely going to go together in the same deck, which one of these cards are worth building around, which of these are good for the meta. What I'm playing with here is far more than just a bunch of singleton jank and seeing what can fit. It is a series of cards that are coming in and out of the deck that are being checked for independence, their dependence on other cards, and their speed. The three most important things about Magic the Gathering. Independence is basically whether it works on an empty board state, like if you top deck it and there's basically nothing left on your battlefield except for maybe a few lands, just the ones that you need to cast it. Does it do anything at all without any kind of setup? And then the synergy, the dependence, does it actually produce more value in combination with other cards, and if so, how much? And then speed is how soon can you do this? Is it practical for you to actually do this thing on turn 2 or turn 3? Is it likely for you to have access to this on turn 4? I ended up with 2 different directions that I could go. One was a Golgari deck that you could start emptying your deck into your graveyard and recur fuel for the Scare Tiller. And eventually try to kill them by recurring Cradle of the Curse, making a bunch of 2/2 zombies. Very strong, potent combo to just repeatedly make a 2/2 for 4 mana, while also having a Survivor's Encampment to both fix you and to tap your Scare Tiller without it needing to attack. Oh, there we go. Now, of course, there were some other variations. The other one was the Simic one, which was trying to use Growth Spiral to the best of its ability as a kind of ramp card, while at the same time trying to also make use of Mystic Sanctuary, because I saw that this card was actually very powerful in Legacy to tutor for with like a fetch land. And so I thought to myself, why don't I just use crop rotation to go get Mystic Sanctuary, and then use Mystic Sanctuary to put crop rotation back on top of my deck to get another crop rotation, while also filling my graveyard with a land for 1 mana. And I can use that crop rotation to actually sack the Mystic Sanctuary to grab the other Mystic Sanctuary or another Mystic Sanctuary, however many you have in the deck, and just stock your graveyard full of lands and thin your deck, while at the same time giving fuel for the Scare Tiller that is also in this deck. Coiling Oracle is very good, and Dreamscape Artist is actually a very cool card to have because it's a Horror on a body as a spell shaper. And sure, the power of Counterspell is one of the best cards in Pauper, and not just in blue. And there's Ire Rune Expedition. Because you're constantly making land drops, it should be relatively easy for you to get this to be a 2-for-1. So the mana base is actually stretched out in this deck, and the deck is trying to go very hard in two different directions. One is for all of the land synergy, which is what we're putting this deck together for in the first place, and the other direction is tempo synergies and a tempo playstyle where you're playing lots of cheap threats and using some very efficient removal spells to throw your opponent off and finishing them off quickly enough that they can't quite recover in time. But unfortunately, to really maximize either one of those, you have to start cutting down on the other. If we start cutting down on the blue to make sure that the lands package is working properly, then we're actually removing some of the islands, and that throws off Mystic Monastery, which means Mystic's Monastery doesn't really have as much value, which means there's not really a big point to playing it if you can't get value out of it. And at that point, you might as well just go back to the more powerful version, which is the black-green version. But if you take out some of the land stuff, you're in a Simic Tempo deck, and the Izzet Tempo deck is actually better than the Simic Tempo deck. So no matter which variation of this Simic deck that you're working with, your alternatives are better than the variations in these colors. So there's no point to be in these colors. So that leaves Pauper lands, the version 3, which is the Golgari one, where you get to empty your graveyard using Stinkweed Imp and Satyr Wayfinder, and try to get as many lands in here as possible. Then using either Grim Harvest to recur your Scare Tiller, get the Scare Tiller out, and start making a bunch of zombies, while also potentially holding up a crop rotation for the Steep or Juka Bog, or find the missing land that you need in your combo, while you can also have Tilling Treefolk to actually get you back some lands to keep making land drops. And there's Sakura Tribe Scout accelerating you, a Boreal Grazer, and then there's like some removal like Grizzly Demise and crop rotation again for that Sagiri Steep? Sagiri Steep, yeah. Pulse Marasa to gain some life and whatnot, recursion. So it's just a 1-for-1 plus a lot of life gain. Expedition map to find whatever the best land in your deck is at the time. And there's actually a very diverse sideboard to handle lots of stuff. Okay, so now we're on the most profitable path, most likely. We've narrowed down a lot of the strategies to what seems the most reliable, or what seems to be the most valuable out of all of them, and what contains the majority of our mechanics that we want to work with and want to see. We now are at the stage of how do we refine this exactly? We have to choose which game mechanics we like the most, what variations of the same game mechanic we might want, or what proportion we might want them at. We have to determine whether something is worth defending, whether something is worth tutoring for, worth building around, and skewing the playstyle of our deck in favor of to maximize that thing's value over perhaps something else. And we have to ultimately decide on a playstyle for our deck to function around. And there's a Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs here, which speaks volumes about this deck, because it is a payoff for having deserts. Not just the card desert, but anything with the type desert, which includes the encampment. So any of those deserts out, it's able to ping people, and it's a great blocker, but it doesn't close out the game very fast, which is the issue. version 4 of the deck, the far more competitive version that actually does have the ability to win a game, potentially. Wow, a whole game of competitive Magic. And as you can see, it's cut down on the primary combo of Scare Tiller and Cradle of the Cursed. And it's added Golgari Rot Farm, so you can continue to make the land drops that you need. And it also has actually more removal, far better removal. It has Severed Strands, because there are certain times where a 0/3 is just not very good, and sometimes 3 life is far better than a blocker. And killing one of their creatures on top of that is pretty great. Where Sakura Tribe Scout just isn't good enough. You're already almost empty-handed. There's little to no lands left, so she's just not valuable. So Severed Strands is a way to get extra use out of the creatures that stop being valuable after a certain point in the game. Drown in Filth allows you to fill your graveyard even more. It's an additional way to do that, and being removal for smaller creatures typically. But later in the game, it does get bigger. Even if you start emptying your graveyard with Scare Tiller, you likely will still have a couple of lands at least in there. Distress to pick apart your opponent's hand. It's the Thoughtseize Pauper, basically. 2 mana actually makes a big difference, unfortunately. And Haunted Fengraph to give you an additional way to recur your creatures from your yard, specifically Scare Tiller. And we have Spore Mound now to give extra value to your land drops. So now your lands also produce 1/1. So every time that you make a 2/2, you also get a 1/1 in this whole combo cycle. And it actually fixes the problem of having 4... Stop. Tap.net. Stop. All right. Of having 4 Scare Tillers, because having 4 of them means that you find them more frequently and much more often they are together. But in multiples, they get worse, because each one you have to pay 4 mana for, and each one you have to find a way to get a target in the graveyard for it, and find a way to tap it, sometimes without attacking, because you might be attacking straight into death itself and their little army they have set up, which is very common that you'll find yourself at parity. One of the last additions to the deck was Servant of Tiamat, or Tiamat? Yeah, Magic has weird names. This one was a 1/3, smaller, but it actually has a front end, so 1/1s can't just randomly swing into it without any kind of repercussion. And the deserts actually do more work, because when this thing blocks them, dealing them 1 damage, the deserts are now able to also poke them for damage. And this thing does give more value to the Survivor's Encampment, and we actually can gain some life off of it, so we are actually able to survive for much, much longer and actually do a lot more work with him. Plus, he has his own way of defending himself with regeneration. So this is a way for us to hold up more mana, not just for this guy's ability, but for our instance, giving more value and more options to the mana that we are holding up, which is fantastic. That plus a much better sideboard featuring Caustic Caterpillar, which you can recur with the Haunted Fengraph and with the Grim Harvest. Of course, the Fengraph is random, but still. And you can also get back Fair Macabre. You have more hate for the elves and the little annoying tokens. Turns out, tokens, big problem. Spore Frog for more of the aggro decks, which we are not favored in those matchups at all. Boggles. Gotta have Tranquility for Boggles. And some life gain with Augur Ilvec. But even though that we are able to get to parity much sooner and maintain it for much longer, and we have far more synergy than any of the variations before, any of the dozens of variations before, we simply can't maintain parity forever. We need to close out the game. And this is not fast enough to do it, and this is not fast enough to do it, and this is not fast enough to do it. Typically, this essentially is, to put it in a great metaphor for this, a beautiful spider web, very strong, very well made, very well crafted, all kinds of amazing things went into making this thing, a lot of effort, but there is no spider. There is no spider to finish off whatever lands in the web. It will always eventually get out. So, where's our spider? There isn't really a great spider for this web. There's no particularly great candidates. There's nothing that synergistic with the deck. There are a lot of options that fit, but none that are particularly as potent as anything like Merit Losh or Hogak in the Legacy Lands deck. So we have to choose some lackluster options. Out of the few dozen options that I checked around for and that I thought would fit the deck properly, I came up with the conclusion that Ulamog's Crusher is obviously the most potent finisher in Pauper that could fit in this deck. It's one of the most potent finishers in Pauper altogether. But there is another, which would be the Crozen Tusker. The Tusker and the Crusher. Yeah, I just realized that a second ago after I already hit the start button. The Tusker is a large body that is a real threat and does have use for us early in the game when maybe we don't have a ton of lands. It is a 2-for-1 and does fill our graveyard, giving some benefit to Drown and Filth. And it does actually help fix us, so we could get the forest or we could get the swamp, and we do get to draw the card when we're cycling with it. So later in the game, it's a finisher that is recurable with Grim Harvest and with the Haunted Fengraf, just like Ulamog's Crusher, but it is better earlier in the game as a 2-for-1. While Ulamog's Crusher is significantly more potent, an 8/8 is definitely better than a 6/5, and Annihilator 2 is nothing short of amazing in Pauper. But if you ever have more than one, it starts to feel like overkill. And I like to point to some Tron builds where they will try to run 4 copies of Ulamog's Crusher, and frequently just one Ulamog's Crusher is enough to do the job, and they're also running recursion. So if you get rid of the first Ulamog's Crusher, and then you just recur that Ulamog's Crusher, then there was really no point to the other Ulamog's Crushers. It's just winning more. You're just spinning your wheels. And to better support Ulamog's Crusher and Crozen Tusker in this deck, I had ended up cutting back on Cradle of the Cursed, because Cradle of the Cursed, although it is an interesting combo, the one that we started building this deck around, it is not potent enough to do the work of Ulamog's Crusher or the Tusker. Tusken Crush, that's what I'm going to call it. It's not as potent as Tusken Crush and Tusk. And we would like actually better access to both of these, so instead I'm going to be playing some Shambling Shells, and I'm going to be adding another Golgari Rot Farm, so that way it is easier for us to make our land drops continuously and continue to ramp up a little bit faster. So that way we can have the mana necessary for Crozen Tusker and Ulamog's Crusher much faster. Crush and Tusk. And I also decided that the Servant of Temet is actually, it is a good card. I feel like I might be a little bit biased, and I might try to protect ourselves from the aggressive decks and the stompy decks a little bit too much after the whole 4-color Scred thing where mono green was rampant in the format. It's great in the more aggressive matchups. It's great when facing down a bunch of 2/2s. It has Regenerate, and we can gain some life off of it, and we can keep our life total up by having this good blocker. But it's not really the thing that you want to have in a control matchup where your opponent's threats are all evasive and all of the removal is very versatile and can exile things or force you to sacrifice things and get around to Regenerate. With that being said, I believe that has covered the bulk of the deck. That has covered basically everything that this deck is about, and the entire maybe 30+ hour journey that I've gone through with this deck and the few dozen games. and the many variations of this deck. These are just the major ones. And if you're actually interested in building your own variation of this deck, or working on this deck, or perhaps you know of a better finisher than Ulamog's Crusher that's more synergistic than Crush and Tusk, then please let me know in the comments below. And if you do want to work on this, you can just go to taptap.net. You can actually make your own copy of this deck, and you can actually start editing it and working on it yourself. You can adjust whatever you would like in it. See, I just made a copy of this, Pauper Lands version 5 copy, and then I can go to edit. I can pick and choose a new name for it. I can choose new hubs, even choose a new format. Like maybe I want to build Pauper Commander deck, who knows? And give it its own description. Plus, I can have access to all of these great cards in the maybe section, mess with the sideboard, main board, choose a new featured card for the deck, choose to make it public, choose to keep it private, do whatever I want with it. But of course, I don't really want this. So, coming in for that face touch, and I'll see you in the next video.